Hi, I'd like to talk about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and kind of introduce the book to you a little bit. Um, so, first of all, why read this? Ancient history, right? It's very old. It's written a long time ago, and it's about slavery. Nobody wants to talk about slavery. It's kind of a downer, right? Well, actually, I think there's a lot of good reasons to read this. One is it's a great story. It's a really, in some ways, a very inspiring story about how a guy starts in slavery and gets to freedom. It's a classic rags to riches story. It's as American a story as it comes. Um, the description of slave life and the suffering he endured is amazing. And frankly, I've taught a lot of books over the years, and this is one of my students' favorites. Um, it's also pretty easy to read. Now, granted, the material is difficult, and in some cases, it's very difficult to read what's happening. Um, but the book is short. The language is straightforward and clear. Um, America's past also, I think, is really important. Now, we all know about slavery, but do we really understand it? Do we really know what it was like? This book gives us a very clear picture of what it was like on a day-to-day basis. Now, right now, there's a lot of history wars going on. There's a lot of debate about America's history, and there are like kind of two camps. One is saying, "Look, why dredge up the past? Um, are we just trying to wallow in guilt? Are we just trying to make white people feel guilty?" The other side's saying, we really haven't come to terms with our racial history, and this affects our current life today. Now, reading this book is not going to answer that question or that debate right now, but I think it sheds some light on the whole experience. And how I see it is slavery and the Civil War. That's America's trauma. It's not the only one, but it's a major trauma. And like all traumas, at first you don't deal with them. You kind of go get on with life, got stuff to do, and at some point you're able to go back and look at your personal traumas and cope with them. And I think maybe that's where we are right now. Maybe we're coming to terms with our past a little better, and this may be part of that. Another thing is, even though it's taking place in the past, there are certain universal principles that great literature will open up and reveal to us. And so read a book like this, it's kind of a window into our own world. It's like you get away from your home and you can kind of reflect back on what your home life was like once you get a little distance. When you're in the midst of it, you can't always see it. In the same way, viewing our a society, a very different society, really shows us the inner workings of societies and how people manage and get along in this. Um, so it helps to view sometimes a different culture and a world. And we're going to learn about the slave society and the slave world. And it's really different, but it sheds some light on our own, I believe. Now, one thing that's going to help us is to understand the nature of ideology. Because what we're dealing with is what this book is largely an attack on the slaveholding ideology. So let's kind of see what ideology is. So here's some definitions. It's a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory or policy. So you can see it's related to ideas, but it's also related to economics and politics, power. Here's from Wikipedia, a little more complicated. An ideology is a set of beliefs or philosophies, especially those held for reasons that are not purely epistemic or logical, in which practical elements are as prominent as theoretical ones. In other words, it's looking not just at ideas like ideas like, say, gravity wouldn't be called ideology because there's no political power, economic power. It's not related to that. It's not supporting any economic system. Gravity's gravity. Okay. There's no, nobody's getting out, getting with it, or getting power because they have a theory of gravity. But theories about why one government is better than another, or the proper role of men and women, or things like this, these do have political implications, and those are ideology. So ideology combines ideas and social power. Now, one way to think about this, here's another way to kind of approach this whole thing about ideology and culture, is to look at the idea of three kinds of reality. There's subjective, it exists depend on entirely the mind of the individual. So my emotions are subjective. Objective exists independently of human consciousness and human beliefs, gravity, okay? Then there's something called intersubjective. So this exists within the communication network linking the subjective consciousness of many individuals. They are real only because many people believe they are real. If a single individual changes his mind or her beliefs, or if that person dies, it's of little importance. If most everybody dies, or most everybody changes their beliefs, then the intersubjective phenomenon will mutate or disappear. So another way to think about this is intersubjective feels as real as objective. It's something what everybody agrees with, and we all think of as natural in most cases. But if nobody existed, that thing wouldn't exist anymore. So think about these. Take a look at these and decide which of these you think are going to be objective. They exist no matter whether anybody exists at all. Subjective, they're only true in my or one individual's feelings. Or intersubjective, they're true because a group of people all agree that they're real. Take a minute to decide. So I'm going to call these like this. Atoms are objective facts. Doesn't matter if people believe in them or not. Laws are intersubjective. If people don't think that the speed limit should be 55, but that there is any speed limit, then it doesn't happen. There doesn't exist. A child's belief in an imaginary friend, that's subjective. Money is intersubjective. Radioactivity is objective. United States of America, intersubjective. Apple Corporation, intersubjective. Now, intersubjective does not mean not real, okay? Try to go without money for the day. Try not following the rules of the United States, or not paying your taxes, or try using a copycat version and selling a copycat version of the iPhone, and you will quickly find out that those things are very real. But their reality is based on the assumptions and beliefs and worldview of everybody, right? And that's one way to look at culture. That's one way just to look at a culture. Culture is the intersubjective realities of a people. And, 300 years ago, people didn't believe in these things. Well, they believed in money, but they didn't believe in the United States or Apple Corporation. They didn't exist, okay? But they do now, and we believe in them, and they're very real. Now, probably the main function, or one function of these imagined orders, or these intersubjective realities, is cooperation. I'm going to use cooperation in quote marks. Sometimes it's more benign, sometimes it's less, but it's always there's a force involved, okay? You think about the Middle Ages, right? You had these institutions. You had the church was an institution, and the monarchy was an institution. And the church taught the divine right of kings. It meant that the king is the king because God chose that king to be in place. And if you disobey the king, you're disobeying God. And of course, the function was really easy. Obey the king, obey the priest, do your duty, play your role. There was a power element to this. Now, sometimes these are more, again, like I said, sometimes the cooperation element is more benign, okay? We all have to get along. Money is great, for example, helping us all get along and deciding how to, it's very useful. So these things are not always sinister. Now, if this order is subjective, though, it's an interesting experiment to think about. What keeps it going? Why did the Middle Ages, they died out, right? The divine right of kings, we don't believe that. The church still exists, but as an institution of massive power like it had back then, nothing like it had back then. And the monarchy is pretty much dead. So what keeps it going? Why do some die? Well, one aspect is never admit that it's imagined. Most of us would be shocked to say that money's not objectively a fact. Okay, well, the dollar bill I have in my hand is objectively a fact, but that it has value is there because everybody believes it. People stop believing it, we get inflation, or we get the money has no value. But as long as we all believe it, as long as we don't admit that it's imagined, then it has a kind of reality, and that helps keep it going. Another thing that keeps it going is education. Get them young, treat them tough, tell them nothing. Get them at a young age. You get people's minds going in a certain way. And I'm as much a part of this as anybody, right? I was taught a certain way, and my mind took on certain channels. And as I get older, I look back and I say, I think this way now because of something I was taught way back then. It really channeled my mind, and our minds are all channeled through education. Another thing that happens in this is that the whole system is embedded through symbols. We have different symbols and different realities that are all interconnected, and that all, it's a system that all goes together. And it's called culture. Now, it's really difficult to change one of these imagined orders. They're really resistant to change because they're all interconnected. So each of us as an individual is influenced by a whole range of a whole network of these ideas that are all interrelated and interconnected. Sometimes they conflict with each other, but in most cases, they hold together and they form a unity. And this is what Frederick Douglass was facing. He was facing not just the slave owner, not just the particular master. He was facing a whole network of beliefs, values, customs, laws, religion, stereotypes, a whole range of ideas that were all interconnected, all connected to his reality, his physical reality, and backed by the lash. And so when he's fighting this system, it's a multidimensional, very complex structure. Now, you're going to see in his story how he escapes. Physically, he escapes, and mentally, he escapes. But you're also going to see how he undermines and attacks the ideology of slavery. So we're going to have to see how that ideology works. And this is the key thing. If you want to change one of these, this system, the place to start is to show that the imagined reality is not natural. It's not objective fact. It's something that's human created. And if humans created it, humans could change it. So a lot of what you're going to see this book doing is to show that the order that is created in the southern states in that slave society was profoundly unnatural and not reflective of how things really are. Now, let's take a look at the slave societies and slave world. Now, this is from 1861 at the onset of the Civil War. The book you're reading was written in 1845, so 16 years earlier. And 16 years earlier, all of this territory here pretty much did not belong to the United States. This is mostly part of Mexico at this time. So, but here you had this part of the country was there, and you could see there was a kind of a finely balanced power between the North and the South, and they were struggling from the 15 years at the time when this book was written until the onset of the Civil War. There was a huge battle over what to do with this whole area here. Should it be slave states or should it be free? And really, that's the root of the Civil War, was The slave states wanted to expand slavery. The northern states wanted to expand free labor, and there were two mutually incompatible systems. One wanted slavery as the root of it, and the other did not, and therein lays the cause of the Civil War. Some people like to say slavery did not cause the Civil War. No, slavery did cause the Civil War. If it hadn't been for slavery, there never would have been a Civil War. On the other hand, the North was not primarily going to try to free the slaves. They were trying to prevent slavery from spreading. They were fighting a slave power. So let's look at this slave power. We're going to look at some kind of the reality they were faced with, and it's really, it was a battle over diverging paths for the nation. Okay, the North was based on an industrial economy. Factories were starting to grow, and it was a dynamic free labor society. So the free labor ideology was an ideology for supporting free labor. It was the kind of the idea that we kind of hear nowadays a lot, that everybody has a chance to get ahead. With hard work, you can get ahead, and you're free to go into anything you have a passion for and you have some skill at. That's what you can go into. It's a very fluid, mobile, upwardly mobile, physically mobile society, very dynamic. The South was an agrarian economy based on slave labor. Slavery was the foundation. They were the labor force. It was a very fixed society. Everybody was supposed to have their place. It was a hierarchical society. We'll see that in a minute. Now, this is interesting. Both the North and the South still had a commitment to the Republic. What they meant by the Republic was a little different. They both had a commitment to liberty. This is kind of weird to us. The South was always talking about liberty, and they were fighting for their liberty and defending their liberty. Liberty to enslave others, yes, but how they define that, we're going to see how they kind of work that out in their minds. But they both had this commitment to liberty, interestingly enough. The South was wealthy at this time, very unequally wealthy, but wealthy nevertheless. The labor of the slaves they made most of the tobacco, sugar, rice, hemp, cotton. 2/3 of all the world's cotton came from the South, and that was produced by the slaves. They accounted for half of all exports. Everything the whole country exported, cotton was half of it. So one aspect of slavery was the value of the labor that the slaves produced. In addition, the slaves were valuable in and of themselves. So if you were a slave owner and you had a male and a female slave, and they had children, that was money in the bank to you. Think of it like stocks. Stocks are valuable because of the dividends they give you, but they're also valuable in and of themselves. And if more people want that stock and think that stock is valuable, the value goes up, and you can sell that stock now at an increase. You get the dividends, get the value of the stock itself. In a similar way, the slaves were valued because of the labor they produced, like the dividends, and in and of themselves, owning a human being. And the 4 million slaves were worth a total of about $3 to $4 billion at the time of the Civil War. That's equivalent to $100 to $150 billion in today's money. 16% of the nation's wealth was tied up in slaves. It exceeded all the value of all the farmland in the South. So even more important than the value that the slaves produced was just having slaves. You could see why, by the way, that the slave states wanted to expand. Because if your slaves are of value, you want to hold the value of those things. Those things, there were things to those people. Those people were things, and they were seen as commodity value. And if you have, if those slaves are reproducing, now instead of 2 slaves, now maybe you have 4 slaves in a few years. Now that value will increase only if they can work somewhere. So if the property is I mean, if the extension of slavery is limited, the value of those slaves is going to decrease because everybody's producing more and more slaves. Slaves are reproducing more and more. The value of them is going to decrease. And so you need more territory and more land to spread and increase the value. And that was a lot of the reason for the Civil War. America's wealthiest men and counties per capita were all in the South. So there was a ton of money to it. So this shows you that there's a lot of value here for certain individuals. They're going to want to keep this. It's also important to know the hierarchy of the South. So at the bottom of the pyramid, there were 4 million enslaved blacks and 6.2 million non-slaveholding whites. So one thing to think about this is, why did all of these non-slaveholding whites support the South in the Civil War? Well, answer one is not all of them did. A lot of them did not support this, but a lot of them did. And we're going to see how the ideology was built to basically build up the ego. You don't own slaves, white people, but at least you're not a slave, and at least you're superior to them. And so you're above somebody. As long as you can be above somebody, you're okay. Now, 340,000 slaveholders. This is about the time of the Civil War. 46,000 people belonged to the planter class, which means they owned at least 20 slaves. So again, it gets smaller and smaller the higher up you go. 10,000 people owned 50 or more slaves. 15 clans or family groups owned 100 or more slaves. 300 individual planters owned at least 250, and 50 planters owned 500 or more slaves. These are massively wealthy people at the top. And so your class structure looked something like this among the whites. This is kind of how it looked. Now, again, why are those 76%? Why are those people here? Why are they supporting a system that they're not really benefiting from? This is an interesting question to think about. And a lot of it relates to the ideology. Ideology was in many ways built to help these people be satisfied with their place. The slave holders had not only a lot of power within the South, but they had a lot of power in the whole country. So the planters, these are the top group, 5-10% of the slaveholders. They controlled the state legislatures of all the South. 12 of the first 15 presidents were slaveholders or allies of the planters. 17 judges of the Supreme Court out of the first 28, 14 attorneys general out of the first 19, 61 presidents of the Senate out of the first 77, 21 speakers of the House out of 33, and 84 foreign ministers out of 134 were all from the planter class. So from the founding up until the Civil War. So one of the things that are really important for us to think about is how do you square this circle, right? How is this compatible with liberty? On the one hand, you can see why the slaveholders are going to hold on to slavery as hard as they can. There's so much riding on it. But how could they make this jive with the whole idea of liberty and the republic? And again, why would poor whites support this system? Here's a quote from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. This is written by Thomas Jefferson, who owned between 165 and 225 slaves on his Virginia plantation. How could a guy who wrote that still own these slaves? How could a guy who owned all these slaves write something like that? And the answer is the ideology. The slaveholder ideology was the way they could justify that. And you'll be reading some passages about these in the next few days. And you'll also see how Douglas, throughout his narrative, undermines the various arguments. So I'll just briefly go through this. So one argument was that it was constitutional. There was a lot of debate as to whether the Constitution supported or undermined slavery. And Douglas was of the opinion that it did not support slavery, but that everybody, it's like the Bible. Everybody can make their own interpretation and prove their own thing, right? So it's the same way people can prove different things. So that's one thing. God's will. This is really interesting to us. To us, is nothing more abominable and anti-religious than slavery. But they argued that, in fact, it's mandated by the Bible and advocated by the Bible. And they rely on some obscure verse. This is Genesis 9:24-7. It's this bizarre story. Noah gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. His son Ham comes in and sees him naked, comes out and tells his brothers, Dad's in there naked. And the two brothers go in there and they don't look. They cover him up in a blanket. Noah wakes up and he's furious. How he knows this, I don't know, but he got furious at Ham for seeing him naked, and he cursed Ham and all his descendants. Now, the Bible says nothing about skin color on this. There's no logical basis for saying that applied to people of African descent, but that's how it was applied. There you go. They also believed it was beneficial to the social order. They believed, this is the slaveholders, or said they believed, if everybody that does their place, everybody in their place, one person's the boss, the other person follows the orders, and they know their place, everything's going to be peaceful. Economically beneficial. They believed it was the best economic system, and they pointed to the wealth of the South as evidence. Although it was very unequally distributed, and it didn't always look like a wealthy place, as you'll see from the book. Beneficial to the slaves. This seems the most perverse to us, but they argued that the slaves were well treated, well taken care of, and they liked it. Yeah, it's good for them. And last of all, that it was the natural order of things. This is again, all of these Douglas is going to attack, but the natural side of it, Douglas is really going to attack that badly. And the argument was that African Americans are made to serve and obey whites. It was based on white supremacy. This is the roots of white supremacy as a justification for this horrid injustice. And this white supremacy continues to this day. Okay, it's not gone by any chance, and it's a trauma that still reeks today. It's a problem that still happens. Now, I'm going to give a trigger warning. I don't usually do trigger warnings, but when I was going through these stereotypes, I wanted to show you some of the stereotypes they show you. And if you want to stop the video here, I get it. That's fine. These are painful to watch, but I'm going to go ahead and present how African Americans were portrayed at this time and in the years afterwards. And I'm going to go through different tropes or different stereotypes. And one was the mammy image, the domestic worker who has an undying loyalty to her slaveholders as caregivers and as counselor, and someone content in their place, happily enslaved. You also notice the physical features, misshapen, exaggerated features, not quite human. And this is one of the most common, but the docile, happy female slave. There was a male counterpart, the Uncle Tom. This is the title character of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was also a very strong anti-slavery book and was also powerful, along with Frederick Douglass's book. In the book, Uncle Tom foregoes the chance at freedom in order to help other people. So he's a giving. Now you think of this. Well, this is kind of a noble thing. Well, yeah, but he's also innately submissive and obedient, in constant desire of white approval. It's portraying slavery in this picturesque, calm environment. And so you have these two pictures of the content slave, the submissive, subservient, and accepting of that. Then you had images, the opposite. Sapphire. This is one we haven't heard. I haven't heard this term till recently. It was a character show from Amos and Andy radio sitcoms. So this is the actual Sapphires later, but the the roots of that image go way back, and it's the sassy, emasculating, domineering woman, aggressive, loud, and angry. And usually paired with a male character who's ignorant and lazy. And the whites' acceptance of this was supposed to imply that slavery and segregation, they were benign, they were okay, nothing wrong with it. It was just, you know. But notice this is kind of the opposite of the mammy, right? There's nowhere in between, right? You're either the mammy or the sapphire. In the same way, you're either an Uncle Tom or you're the Mandingo, the black buck, you know, animalistic and brutish, born for hard labor, dangerous and fearful, especially in his sexuality, right? And again, there's nothing in between. There's no normal average person, right? These are all stereotypes and really negative, hostile ones. The clown, of course, is another one. Notice again the grotesque features that this person's not human. And it's incompetent, unintelligent, ridiculous. And I don't want to end on a downer like that, but I think it's important to mention those stereotypes, that they're rooted in slave times, and they do continue to this day. And but I also want to point out the powerful influence of this book and other narratives like this. There are a whole series of slave narratives, and then books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were very powerful at shaping opinions. They were very powerful at undermining the ideology. Revolutions end in bullets and blood, but they start with words. And a book like this is indeed revolutionary. And so I hope you can see the revolutionary nature of this, and I hope you can see how this book really undermines and attacks this. I think it'll add to your enrichment of the reading of the book. Okay, I look forward to reading this with you. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Thank you.